Hi, everyone, and welcome back to Adult Bible Studies. I'm Wayne Williams, and it's my privilege to be with you today. Thank you so much for sharing your time to study God's Word together with me today. I hope this can be a meaningful time for you. We're continuing on in the third lesson of a unit of lessons that has to do with the awe of God, being aware of just God's great majesty and power and little bits and pieces as we as human beings are able to understand God Himself. A couple of weeks ago, we looked at uh, the awe that we come into about God when we, through creation. And who among us has not stood on a mountaintop or stood at a lake shore or the ocean shore or in some natural setting and not been touched by the reality of God? Not have realized that certainly something far greater than us put all of this together in such a fine and wonderful balance. And we give God the praise. It's an awesome time because our God really is an awesome God. Likewise, last week we looked at Isaiah and his call as a prophet. And we saw how he was in awe of God there in the temple as he saw God's cloak and as he saw the attendance of God there on the as he sat on the throne in the holy of holies, and Isaiah's brokenness that he felt, his own personal salvation kind of experience there because he saw God, and when he saw God, he saw himself, and when he saw himself, he saw how impure and inappropriate it was for him to even hope to have a relationship with God. And he fell before God and repented. And God offered forgiveness and love, as He does you and I when we repent. When we say, Father, forgive me, I messed up. And not only does He forgive us, but just like in that call for Isaiah, He calls us into service. He says, now, Wayne, you've learned a lesson, you've got some new insights. Here's something I want you to try to do. I want our relationship to grow stronger by being active in a relationship. Today we're going to look at a third idea of the awesomeness of God and the awe of God as we look at the story of Jesus's transfiguration there on that mountainside late in his ministry. It was a time when he drew aside with Peter, James, and John and authenticated to them who he was and gave to them the kind of relationship and the kind of experience with him that could carry them through the hard times ahead. We're going to look at Mark, the ninth chapter, and beginning with verse 2. And verse 2 starts off with 6 days later. Now, anytime a passage starts off with something like that, you realize, wait a minute, there has to be something that came before this that it's referring back to. 6 days later, 6 days after what? Well, when we look in chapter 8 of Mark, what we find is that prior to this is the situation where Jesus has come to his disciples and he's asked them that question, who do people say that I am? And they came back with several kinds of responses. Some say Elijah, some say this person or that person, some say you're a prophet. And Peter said, Lord, you are the Christ. And Jesus said, blessed are you, Peter, for you have not received this insight by your own intellect, by your own understanding, but it's a sign that God has touched your life and granted to you this insight. It's not of us to understand God and to recognize God in this way. And it's God's gift to us. In love, He reveals Himself to us. And when we get it, what a marvelous time that is. And Jesus praises Peter profoundly for being the one who was able to put it together at that moment. Now, a few minutes later, A few days later, whatever, we don't have an exact timeline there. Peter messed up again. He's just like you and I. He got off track with his thinking, and when Jesus started talking about the fact that he would die and be resurrected, uh, Peter rebuked him, and then Jesus in turn had to rebuke Peter. That strong rebuke, "Get thee behind me, Satan." What a stinging comment that must have been for Peter, and kind of a really one of those shakes. I talked last week about giving somebody a good shake. Well, that was certainly something I'm sure that shook Peter. And if he was feeling extra high and holy because of the insight he had had, he was brought down to earth real quickly by this inability to put it together in the context of Jesus needing to suffer, having to suffer because of our sin debt, and because of God's purity. Well, that's what brings us up to this. It was 6 days after that Jesus took that moment to withdraw to a mountaintop. We're not sure which mountaintop this is, but isn't it significant that God often uses mountains as places where people can draw aside and feel God's presence and know his presence in a special way? I watched a video the other day of a man climbing a mountain. I can't imagine doing such a thing myself. He was hanging on by one hand at times, just dangling way up in the air, and it certainly could have been. If he lost his grip, he would have been killed. But he managed to keep his footing, managed to find foot handholds and footholds, and climbed up that mountain. And the very last scene was a picture of him standing on the very tip of that mountain and looking out and being able to see in all directions, all sorts of things. Mountaintops. Perhaps that's where the saying comes for us when we talk about mountaintop experiences. We love those mountaintop experiences with God, don't we? And we have those mountaintop experiences. And for Peter, James, and John, this was a true mountaintop experience. It's significant too that Jesus took with him Peter, James, and John. These three are very special people to Jesus. He was mentoring them to be leaders in church, to be leaders in leading out and sharing the gospel. And there's several times when it's Jesus, Peter, James, and John who are together when different things take place. We can remember when Jesus raised Jairus' daughter uh, from the dead, and Peter, James, and John had come to be with him during that time. It's Peter, James, and John who, after Jesus was talking, using the uh, idea of the temple being destroyed and him raising it back up in 3 days, it was the three of them who were confused and confounded enough by that statement to draw aside with Jesus and get some special counsel about what does this mean, Lord? Help us to understand. And Jesus did that, have that special time with him. And then, of course, we remember specifically that it was Peter, James, and John that Jesus asked to withdraw with him into the Garden of Gethsemane that special night when he prayed and prepared himself for the torment and the sacrifice that he would make. It's these three men who were there. It was these three people who Jesus chose to be with him. Can you imagine how alone Jesus must have felt at times? And these men had a special ministry to Jesus, and that they provided that companionship and friendship and closeness. We need that, don't we? I don't do well when I'm all alone, when I'm not having contact with other people, when I'm winging it, so to speak. Uh, this COVID stuff has made us all certainly very aware of that cloistered cabin fever kind of idea. And these men helped Jesus in that sense by just being companions. It reminds me that sometimes God just wants me to walk with him. He doesn't want me to uh, share with him. He doesn't want me to try to dazzle him with my brilliance or my insights or whatever. He just wants me to walk with him and to observe him and to listen and to be aware of his presence. It authenticates that I am receiving his love and he is giving me that love. What a powerful time. Peter, James, and John. Jesus is withdrawing with these three special men during this time. It says there that he was transformed in front of them. That's the uh, word used by the translator in our lesson material. Transformed. Transfiguration came out of the King James Version. And basically, it means he changed his form. And what we see there is a reality that Jesus is not limited to this physical realm. It's authentication to Peter, James, and John that there's more. There is more to life. There is more to the world. There is more to things than just flesh and blood and sight and smell and sound and sensation. There is a whole different level of reality. And Jesus, in his being transformed, was sharing with them this more. They didn't get it right then. Probably they didn't register to them a whole lot, but I'm sure that as time went on, they began to really understand that. And certainly after the resurrection, they could begin to understand that Jesus and God's people are not subject to the same kind of limitations that they have known before. He was transformed in front of them, and his clothes were amazingly bright, brighter than if they had been bleached white. Bleached white. I do the laundry sometimes, and one of the things that my wife has patiently taught me to do is use some bleach on those white clothes. Uh, Give them a little extra something to help get rid of that any soiling or any uh, things that are on the cloth. And with the bleach, it does a much better job. Jesus, they're likening Jesus's garments to something that's been bleached and cleansed and been made pure, uh, because there's just no other way to describe it. Jesus is transformed light, pure light. When Moses came down from Mount Sinai, his countenance had changed and he had a radiance about him. There's something about God's presence and this radiance that fills us with light and hope. His clothes were bright. And with him was Elijah and Moses. The best we can figure about the significance of these two men in particular being there with him is that Moses represents the law. Next week, we're going to look at Moses. But Moses represents the giving of the law to the people, the formulating of the law, to being able to understand how it all fits together and working out a system whereby people could use the law as guidance. Elijah represents the prophets. And when we studied about John the Baptist during Christmas, we saw that he was the one coming in the spirit of Elijah to prepare the way for the Messiah. So Elijah and Moses are significant people, for they bring into our understanding the fact that God has had a plan for a long time, from the very beginning of creation, from the days of Moses, the days of Elijah and the prophets, the days of Christ, and the days of today. God's plan is fulfilling itself and working itself through. And all of these things come together. Elijah's prophecy was not discounted by Jesus' ministry. Moses and the law was not discounted by Jesus in his ministry. In fact, they all fulfilled one another and reinforced one another. Here we go with Peter again. Peter reacted, it says, to all this by saying, Jesus, Rabbi, it's good that we're here. Let's make 3 shrines, one for you and one for Moses and one for Elijah. He said this because he didn't know how to respond, for the 3 of them were terrified. Do you know those kind of people that just always got to have something to say? Peter's one of those kind of folks, isn't he? And sometimes what those folks come out with is humorous when you stop and think about it for a minute. But it's just almost like that's their way of releasing the tension in a particular moment, and they have to say something. Well, Peter said something. He went back to the tradition of when you have a special encounter with God. In the Old Testament, they would pile up rocks and make a pillar to indicate to others who came that way that in that spot they had had a special encounter with God, and all these symbols. And Peter just kind of blurts it out. He felt like he needed to do something. Now that's a good impulse to feel like you need to do something. The other side of the impulse, though, is that when we're too impulsive, we can strike off in the wrong direction. And Jesus says, that's not important. That's not what this is about. What this is about is the 3 of you seeing me in my transformed state and understanding that my ministry is fulfilled and being fulfilled. There's a plan to my ministry. It's not random, even though at times it may feel that way to you. And it's moving ahead to authenticate Jesus to these disciples, to give them an absolute concrete miracle whereby they could remember in those hard times that they would face in the future. I remember when I saw Jesus transfigured. I remember when I heard God's voice say. And in verse 7 it says, then a cloud overshadowed them, and a voice spoke from the cloud, this is my son whom I dearly love. Listen to him. Suddenly looking around, they no longer saw anyone with them except Jesus. Sounds a little bit like Isaiah's calling yet last week. He was in the temple and he saw the cloud and heard God's voice, heard God's call. God authenticates Jesus. And he says, this is my son. Peter, you had it right when you said you are the Christ. Keep that thought in your minds and in your hearts, and let that be the guiding principle that leads you into all other things of the relationship. Suddenly, it was over. When we have those mountaintop experiences, they are so wonderful. We wish they would last forever, don't we? And yet, they seldom do. We come down off the mountain. We get back involved in our everyday lives and routines. We mess up again. We go back and forth. And yet, because of those mountaintop experiences, because of those times when God touches our lives in a special way, we have stability and faith and hope that goes far beyond tomorrow and on to an eternity with Him. The awe of God, the awe of Jesus, that He would be God, yet come to live among us to show us the way. Praise be to God. I hope you have a wonderful week this week. Keep praying. Pray for me, and I'll pray for you. Thank you so much. And God bless.